Hey, welcome everyone to this week's Thursday Forum. I'm Haley Duschinski. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies and the School for International Studies and Languages here at Ohio University. We're so happy to see all of you here with us today for this week's Thursday Forum. As you know, the Thursday Forum is the School for International Studies and Languages weekly event featuring international research, scholarship, and creative activity for the benefit of the entire university. We're so pleased to see so many students and faculty and friends from colleges across the university join us today because we have a very special panel event. So I'm opening the event, and it's my pleasure to introduce our real host for the event today, which is Dr. Geoff Dabelko, professor at the Voinovich School of Public Policy and Leadership. And Dr. Dabelko is known to many of you. I know that he teaches many of the courses for the students in the center and in the school. He's been a professor and a mentor to many of you in the room, and I'm sure he's familiar to you already. Of course, his research focuses on environmental peace building, climate security, age-friendly, climate-resilient communities, and environmental leadership. Dr. Dabelko has been with us here at Ohio University since 2012, so a little bit over a decade. And of course, he's a faculty affiliate of the Center for International Studies and has worked closely with all of us over the years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dabelko, and he will introduce our panelists here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duschinski. Thank you, Haley. Thank you, Bree. Thank you, Kat, and our CIS friends. This is a fantastic forum that you have every weekend, so it's a real service to campus and Issues International on campus that you get us together on this regular basis. Some of you may know that this week was the International Studies Association conference in Columbus, where a number of folks working international environmental issues for now many decades, we'll say, regularly come together. And when it was in Columbus for the first time in my memory, that goes back to at least 1990, so it doesn't happen, where they were so close, I suggested to some friends and colleagues that wouldn't it be fun to come down? I promised good weather and all sorts of enticements to get them to come. But actually the enticement was, listen, we have some really bright people who want to engage on these topics in Athens. And so please, can you stay a couple extra days in Ohio and have a chat, right? And so that's what we're going to do today with a topic that's been entitled Navigating a New Era in International Environmental Diplomacy, or maybe Global Environmental Diplomacy. We could debate which one or both it should be. With the, in some ways, topical in the news headline that makes this really, really important because, as I'm sure you know, in this country, the United States, we have decided to pull out of some institutions that we, as a country and globally, have spent a lot of time putting together to try to tackle these problems that cross boundaries. Ones like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, often referred to as Paris Agreement, pulling out of the scientific bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, World Health Organization, the shuttering of the U.S. Agency for International Development, where much of our international environment development climate funds that were supporting efforts overseas went through. And so from my vantage point, in some ways, it brought me back to when actually Stacy and Ken and I were all at the University of Maryland in the early 1990s. It was the end of the Cold War, and suddenly all our assumptions about how we did things in international relations were turned upside down with the end of the Cold War. And then similar, 9/11 happens, and a whole nother, I won't call it an opportunity, but a necessity to re-examine how cooperation and how conflict was proceeding, including in these topic spaces of environment and development and climate, foreign policy, peace and conflict. One might even have COVID in there too. So are we at this moment where we have to because the issues are pressing, and have to because the institutions that we've been relying on, maybe wisely, maybe not, are really fundamentally in flux. And while I used US examples on fundamental change, and they are dramatic and notable, it's not only in the US where the questions of the priorities and the attention to these issues are coming forward. And so it's in that context then that we're going to have a roundtable discussion. I'm going to give our panelists, after I introduce them, and say a couple other words about an associated opportunity we have topically, but I'm just going to pose maybe 3 different questions that each of them will answer, and then I and they look forward to engaging with your questions and your comments and your insights, because it really is going to require all of us to think creatively and find new ways to cooperate on these issues to tackle them. So I'm going to, hopefully those of you who needed to check in with the QR code have done so, and here's that kind of title and such. Ken Conca, who just happens to be sitting next to me, as you can figure out from the photo. Ken is a professor at American University, somebody who has written widely on international environmental topics. You'll hear him talk today about water. I chose among his many books this cover of his take on the environment at the UN, since we're talking about international institutions. Ken is a Berkeley PhD, one of the more interesting interdisciplinary PhDs, where you actually get to work across disciplines. That doesn't always happen. And someone who has been a collaborator and mentor to me since he came in those early 90s to Maryland as a faculty member when Stacy and I were graduate students at Maryland. So we have a few decades of history together. So Ken, this is not Ken's first time on campus. He's kindly guest lectured on campus, including his After the Flood, Searching for Resilience in Ellicott City book. We have a lot of people do water work, including locally. And so his scope and focus ranges domestic, international, and importantly, the links between them. I think in order, yes, gosh, you guys behaved and sat in even order of the introduction. Dr. Ashok Swain. Ashok is the head of the Department of Peace and Conflict at Uppsala University in Sweden. He's the editor of the journal Environment Security. So many of you who are working in that topic space, a number of them working with me, this is the editor for the journal that is really a prime location for peer-reviewed work that also is engaged with application. So kind of that mix of applied research that we're looking for. Ashok's also the UNESCO chair on international water cooperation, so very active in the water area, but also kind of connected to the UN systems that are working in this space. I'm not sure anybody has edited more handbooks than, which is remarkable because he's also done, like the climate security book, a whole host of articles and topically focused ones, but he also kind of in that journal editor role really plays a leadership role in knowing the different topics, pulling the right people together, sharing diverse perspectives under one cover so that we can dig into environmental peace building and environment conflict, climate security. And so, Ashok, it's terrific, again, that you were able to stay in the States for a couple extra days and join us. And then Stacy VanDeveer, I think his second visit to Ohio University, although most of you weren't here then, it was probably 10 years ago. Yeah. Stacy is at the University of Massachusetts, Boston.
You will not change it.
Oh,
I'm still there.
okay, yeah, well, you know, it's a good looking picture.
I'll take credit for Ashok.
Okay. Stacy's also a prolific author, both in kind of deep dives on a variety of topics and playing this leadership role in pulling people and topics together for interdisciplinary dialogues. One example here, he is the grad director of a very innovative PhD program that brings together human security and global governance within a larger department that adds conflict resolution to that. And one place that I will say, many of your predecessors have found their way for degrees there. So we have we're very proud of an informal Ohio University to UMass Boston pipeline that comes largely out of the CIS degrees. And so it's terrific to welcome Stacy here as well. Before I pose that first question about how they suggest we navigate a new era of international environmental diplomacy, Just one word. These two, some of you I told we were going to be a larger panel. Erica Weinthal is in Lisbon at a NATO workshop on Ukraine, and she is an expert, and so it's good that they're hearing from her, and so we miss her, but that's where she is. And Lauren Herzer-Reese, who is my successor a couple times removed at the Woodrow Wilson Center, now at the Stimson Center running the Environment Security Program. Her excuse is good, but not so good. She's with her family. That's where she should be. It's just in a lovely place, so it's hard to be sympathetic. So just one word to say that these three people are absolutely leaders in the intellectual thought and the applied work in questions of environment, peace, and conflict, including environmental peace building. All of us were part of a 2002 book called Environmental Peacemaking that Ken and I edited, and Ashok and Stacy contributed to. And so it made a lot of sense for us to feature what is a new book, Essential Concepts of Environmental Peace Building, that are done in part with the Environmental Peace Building Association. And yes, as a former board member, and Ken is on there now, but we've all kind of played roles. So it is both our duty and our honor to suggest that all of you, especially while you're students and joining the association is less expensive, that this is a fantastic network that does some of this leadership on books that will be, hopefully, if you're working in this space, quite useful. We've gotten a small amount of money to purchase 9 books that we're then going to give away. So you students who signed your card, at the end, we'll pull 9 cards, and when this book comes out in a couple months, we'll get you copies of that. It is part of this Environmental Peace Building Association that is meant to bring scholars and practitioners together to do the kinds of things associations do. But as opposed to many, this is truly an international group. As the kind of numbers indicate where people are coming from, and different stages of careers and locations, and applied practitioners as well as scholars. So this group is getting together in Ottawa in June for a big open meeting.
Thereby reducing the boycotts.
Yes, and the Canadians who didn't want to come to the International Studies Association conference this week for voting with their feet will be there as well, and so that'll be a great event. So this is how we can get in touch if you're interested in talking. So with that introduction, Ken, I'm going to hand it to you first. Your suggestions on how we should think about or start to navigate, if it is a new era in international environmental politics. And I should also say, part of the reason that we're all sitting and not roaming around is that thanks to fantastic efforts from Bree, we're able to webcast this. And so that's why we're staying put, so that it can be on camera.
Thanks, Geoff. Thank you all for coming out, and hello to those of you who are online. You are not forgotten. I don't look at the camera occasionally as I talk. I don't know if it's a new era. It's certainly a challenging moment. We can't engage any of the major environmental challenges that we face without doing it through broadly international collaboration, whether we're talking about biodiversity, climate, water, whatever it may be. It's simply not possible. Of course, it's a challenging era for any form of international collaboration today. We could have the same conversation about world monetary policy, about trade policy, about disruptive new technologies like AI, about the battle against terror. In fact, we were just, as Geoff mentioned, at the International Studies Association meeting in Columbus. This is the largest organization in the world that gathers researchers and scholars and thinkers, and also draws in some policymakers and activists and so on in international affairs, broadly defined. And the number of people who chose not to attend this meeting because they're currently boycotting the United States, or were unable to attend this meeting because of the visa challenges that anyone in the university system knows about all too well today. It was really striking the way that it impacted us. So there's no question that we're at a very difficult moment for international cooperation, and we have to sort of measure our ambitions accordingly. I mean, the demand is there. Just because we pretend that we can withdraw from treaty regimes, that the problems are not serious, or they will be fixed by some combination of money and drilling for oil and et cetera. We can pretend that, but it's obviously false. But I don't know that that is new. As Geoff mentioned, I became a university professor in the early 1990s. And right around the time of the Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, 193 countries attended the Rio Earth Summit. Almost every single one of them sent, as the chief of mission, as the chief of delegation, the head of state of the nation. Not the environment minister, not the foreign minister, not some mid-level functionary who would do the diplomatic niceties. The head of state. That meeting produced the Convention on Biodiversity. It produced the UN Convention, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, the Desertification Convention, Agenda 21, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to explain to someone who is not as old as I am and has not been, I like to think I'm much older than I look. I don't know if that's really true anymore. But I've been a university professor for 35 years. It's hard to explain the sense of optimism, the possibility of a sort of a broadly liberal internationalist engagement through the construction of international environmental law to deal with these challenges. And much has been accomplished through that strategy. But some of the basic facts, we are not generating treaties, either regionally or nationally, on environmental challenges at nearly the rate that we did in the 1990s. The rate of generation of treaties has fallen off. Worse, we're not innovating in the treaties that we have. One of the great contributions of international environmental law in the 90s and 2000s in particular to international law more broadly is the idea that treaties are not handcuffs that nations use to bind themselves to permanent fixed commitments. Treaties are dynamic structures and frameworks through which we can improve the quality of our governance over time. The very idea of a conference of the parties, which many of you are familiar with through the climate regime, that's an innovation in international law. It says we have to update and modernize and visit and talk and use the new science and et cetera, to make this dynamic. But if you look at the rate at which treaties are being amended, updated, adding new protocols, that too has sort of fallen off the cliff. And I think one of the reasons why this has happened, and I talk a little bit about that in the book that Geoff put on the screen, and I'll stop in a moment and pass it to my colleagues who maybe they think we are in a new era and they can tell you why. One of the reasons I think that has happened is that the basic model that has been pursued has been the idea of better development within nations and better law between nations. And I think both of those are absolutely essential, but they don't begin to name the scope of the challenge that we face in a cowboy casino world economy of the sort that we live in today. And so I think the big strategic mistake that was made in the 1990s that we're still paying for is key pieces of that global governance framework that we were trying to build. The idea of a human right to the environment, that citizens would be empowered to press claims around the environment and that they would have a sort of an international legal apparatus to stand behind them. Very underdeveloped, starting now just to come online. And also the ways that the environment can get caught up in questions of violence, questions of peace and conflict. The enormous peace opportunities that we can build out through environmental cooperation on the one hand, but also the tensions, the violence, the conflict, the risk. We see what's going on with critical minerals in the world today, and we see what, the message we're getting from the White House about critical minerals and so on. Those are not secondary. We can't just come together with an idea of cooperative collective action and write treaties on individual issues and think that we will adequately create sustainability and environmental protection. We have to create a rights base for that for people all around the world. And we have to deal with the fact that these are deeply conflictive issues. We have to manage the risk of violence and build out the opportunities for peace. So one of the things that I argued in that book, and I can say more about it, I'm going to pass the microphone now, is that in some ways, we've been sort of on a 30-year arc of decline because of some strategic errors that were made when we had that opportunity in the early 1990s. And if I could go back and tell my 35-year-old self, 32, I guess, 35, 67, do the math, 32-year-old self, to put much more emphasis on at the time, it would be building those sort of political foundations for the kind of cooperation that we actually need today. I do not think it is too late to do that. I think it remains a big piece of the challenge in front of us. And there are maybe some things that are happening about that we might cycle to later. But so that's the way I think about it in a kind of a broad brush framework.
Thank you. Thank you, Geoff, for bringing us here. A beautiful campus. I mean, I come from a campus which is always 1477, but I think I love your campus more than ours. We don't have a campus. I think I don't want to agree with you, but I have to. I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, yes, it's right. It's a challenging time, but I think it's probably not a new era, but it's a different era. The thing is that, yes, nothing was all great. We were in a process where we were moving in the right direction. There are three types of countries, those who were there, probably addressing environment and climate issues. One, which was, first of all, accepting there is a climate change, there is an environment issue, trying to do a little bit, but not doing enough. The second one, those who were admitting there is climate change and environmental damages, but they were not doing anything, just trying to subvert the process by blaming others. The other one, there's a very few, those who are accepting it and doing nothing. So there's a three type of characters were there. What has happened now? We see nobody is doing anything. Everyone is supporting the process or not accepting what is happening. It is always important to realize that a country like the United States, when it is not part of the climate negotiation process, some people will say it's a good thing because probably they were trying to subvert a lot of activities, so it's better to do certain things. But that doesn't work that way. Once the US went out of the, of course, the achievement like 2015 Paris Agreement, we might not be very happy with it, but I think there have been several actions which the countries took. The agreement of nearly 200 countries, we agree on something which is, I mean, there are certain issues which are not good enough, but they were supposed to be protected. But what has happened afterwards, we have gone backwards. So I think this is where we need to realize what is going on at present. I think the issue is that countries, particularly in Europe, where I come, you would expect, I don't want to blame only what is happening in the United States, and that's something we all know. Europe tried to pretend that it is somehow has the moral capacity to address this all the time, to put this in focus, but in the different climate, different environmental summits. That's not doing anymore. A country like Sweden, where I come from, you will not listen a single word about climate change or environment in the election discourse. 4 years back, there was an election. You expect that this country will be talking about climate change. Nothing. Only how to get new energy. A country which had gone past a referendum that it will get rid of all the nuclear energy has become now the good energy. So how to put the renewable nuclear energy? And this is not only happening in Sweden. This is happening in Germany. This is happening anywhere in Norway. The elections, you will see it. There is France, you name it. Nowhere, nobody is talking about the climate change. Why they are not talking about climate change? It's not fashionable anymore because they can get the votes for it. And that is what is becoming more and more problematic. If the countries in Europe will not able to talk about this issue, then do you expect in China doesn't take an election? Do you think people in Egypt, people in India, people in Malaysia, they will talk about climate change? Yes, people do, but doesn't reflect in the election discourse. And I think that's very important, that why we need to realize we keep on blaming politicians. They're not doing enough in this process. Why they will not, while they will do, if this is not part of the democratic electoral process. It's not an issue. And this is how we need to realize how to make it an important. When there is a Russia attack Ukraine, the gas price in Sweden, the gas price everybody will understand in the sectors that are coming up. It was 14 krona, $1.5. I mean, we pay more in gas price. It was 50% increase immediately after that. 50% of gas price within a week. Not a single person said anything why there is a 50% increase in the gas price. The reason? Because there is a threat of Russia. But if on the issue of climate change, we want to get into this, increase the gas price that people don't use the gas that much, we will use that investment in other places. Can a politician do that? Or can any political party, any political leader, even in Europe, can do that? No. I think these are the questions we need to realize, that it's not only the politicians, the way the issues is being framed. Yes, I have been, we have been in a part of this debate that the environment, climate issue is a human security issue. I completely agree that it's a human security issue. It should not be securitized. But if it doesn't get securitized, how do you expect these political leaders, I'm not talking about Trump, I'm talking about the other sensible political leaders in different parts of the world, those who accept that there is a climate change issue? Will they be able to take electorally a wise decision of doing something on the climate change issue or on the environmental issue, which will not get immediate return in a few years or in the electoral cycle? They have to wait for ages what will happen. So who to blame? Will you blame the politicians, or will you blame the voters, or will you blame the political discourse ongoing? And I think this is a larger question. The larger question is how to securitize these issues. And securitize issue in such a way it will not harm the human security, but it will give the enough possibility, electoral support to the political leaders, those who are willing to take actions which are in need for the interest for the to address the issues. I will stop.
Thanks. A couple of things. On the question of the new era, I mean, in every new era, some things stay the same, and some things change. And so I think actually it's a good frame for the talk, precisely because I think that's what we'll be figuring out over the next few years. But I will say that the role of the United States does seem to be changing pretty substantially in the multilateral system. At the very least, my country is a very, very unreliable partner. So even if there's a change in leadership in different directions, it's hard to imagine anyone trusts anything for long-term commitments in this country, in kind of the multilateral system. So I think we do, the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, the UN headquarters is in New York, and the country is increasingly pretty hostile to them. So I think that the country has never loved them in terms of our politics, but I think I think that people who work in international organizations and a lot of NGOs and implementing organizations who do the work of international organizations around the world, they all think that things are changing in a particular way because of the lack of American support, engagement, or the outright American hostility towards multilateral cooperation. So lots of other things can stay the same, but I think we kid ourselves if we think that the current occupant of the White House, when he goes, however he goes, out of the building, I don't think that we think that there's, the old days of American leaders constantly saying we're the essential I mean, Democrats will say we're the essential country when they run for re-election, but whether or not they can mean it or do anything about that seems to me to be a question. So I would focus a little bit on that American role as something that I think actually is maybe substantively changing. So then what happens next? I think when we look at things like climate cooperation, biodiversity cooperation, the new treaty for the oceans, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. Here, I think there are a couple of things to watch that are really interesting and have potential. Like because it's not just this year and it's not just Trump, the multilateral system, as Ken said, has not been producing very much agreement and has been struggling for some time. So I think when we're looking for the hope there, we see these kind of clubs and coalitions, countries that want to push an agenda forward are, trying to found more groups to do that, whether they're trying to phase out coal or do particular types of ocean protection or organize a moratorium for deep sea mining, as some of them are doing at sea. That you see these kind of coalitions of leaders, some people call them clubs, sometimes they're called in international relations or mini-lateralism. I think this is a dynamic place. I can't tell you, how much it's going to accomplish, but I can tell you that there's dynamism and there's energy there. I think we see that both the Chinese state and Chinese firms and Chinese sectors are increasingly influential around the world. So when we start to look at the relationship of the European Union and China in some of these multilateral affairs, this is an interesting place to look, see what's happening. When we look at the relationship of Chinese actors, public and private, across lots of the states in the Global South or across lots of projects in the Global South, this is a kind of interesting place to look for things that may be new, and sometimes we're going to find things that are not very new. So I think just looking at like where dynamism can go, and that leads me to thinking about rather than thinking about biodiversity as one big international treaty-bound regime, or climate change as the annual COP, although I think those are very important. I'm not among people who poo-poo the annual meetings. I think very important are happening there, but a lot of important stuff happens at those meetings, not between the states who are negotiating. I mean, just to put it bluntly, there's a lot, the innovation is happening outside of the hallway. And for those of you who study some aspects of American politics, or for those of you who come from other parts of the world that has a government similar to this one in its, say, lack of leadership in environmental politics, can I say that? I think, that lots of other places in society are where we're looking for energy and dynamism when we're kind of depressed that our states aren't producing it. So I think you can see this in international cooperation. You can see it on initiatives to change the trajectory of coal, or to improve aspects of species protection or biodiversity conservation. And then one more kind of development that I can't decide whether is yet new or not, but I think the general optimism that some of us are old enough to have seen lots of optimism in environmental and resource politics, that firms and corporations would kind of change their ideas and norms, and the greener ones would lead the sectors. I don't think there's much optimism on that anymore. So I think selling the idea of private sector-led global environmental sustainability is getting harder. That's a harder message to sell because it just has not produced very much in the way of system transformations. So there are some firms that are a lot better than others in any particular set of behaviors, and that may be important. But I think we're left in a more skeptical age about giant corporations or sustainability offices. So another way to see that, and how I'll close, is that I think that if we think about like navigating a new or a changing kind of turbulent environment, I think as students and academics and activists, whatever combination of roles you want to play, like explicitly looking for the centers of hope and energy and dynamism and where people seem to be seriously trying to do something, that matters for the future. Like, try to keep your eye as focused as often on where people are accomplish something as we often do on the very obvious daily stream of headlines across our lives and brains about what our states are often doing, which is not nearly the sorts of things that many of us would like.
Yeah, hold on to it and
Okay.
let's go down a level. Each of you have areas where you're spending particular time and resources and focus. So Stacy, maybe starting on some of that deep sea that mining that you talked about, some of the atmospheric work that you're doing, how you see these kind of trends in there and how it kind of connects to these larger developments.
Okay, cool. So the campaign to phase out coal has sort of gained steam. Lots of countries have joined in the idea of completely phasing out coal. And on the one hand, you think they count the countries and the declarations, and that all sounds good. But China and India and a handful of others have increased their coal consumption so much that really there's not much, not only is there not a change in the curve, it's still been going up a little bit. But it seems possible, right, that some of the combination of changing renewable energy prices and solar and wind and these kinds of things, it seems to me that the energy transition has some really dynamic places. And I think one of the things that we have to look at on the automobile side is that when you watch what the current administration in this country has done to the EV market and to the electric vehicle producers in the country, it's obviously a mistake. Like it is obviously the case, in my view, that the American automobile industry is being positioned by my government as obviously going to lose this race, and they're already losing. So they were kind of pledging to catch up, and that's going to happen. So I think when we look at the emission side, there's some reason to hope and see some dynamism. When we see a couple of other kind of emerging technologies, deep sea mining is one, and some solar geoengineering on the other. Here, I think the challenge for activists is to keep really nefarious private sector actors from getting giant public subsidies to mine the floor of the ocean or to experiment with explicitly managing the atmosphere. These two activities are very expensive. They are not going to be some booming private sector market anytime soon. And the only way they'll ever be a booming private sector market, and I'm not convinced on either front, is they require gigantic subsidies from the taxpayer. And so my view is if we want to fight some of the sorts of things that we think should not happen, like raking over and destroying underwater, undersea and deep sea ecosystems, or having some few people, mostly in military contractors and large tech firms, manage the content of the atmosphere, I think that we know what we have to stop, because it isn't a giant economic opportunity, it's a giant ask for subsidies, for taxpayer subsidies. And we have to keep the corruption out. So in my view, you think about how those fit together. And another way to say that is precisely that if we have environmental values and if we have internationalist values, we shouldn't want to experiment with any of these sorts of things that are going to highly concentrate really destructive activities in the hands of a few, over which the rest of us will have no governing authority and no participatory way in at all. So just, I would say, keep hammering on the fact that we have expectations for government. And mostly that still means, because these international forums are far away, they're as far away from Boston most of the time as they are from Ohio. That mostly means we have to keep up our energy to keep our own states from doing the wrong thing and supporting the wrong kind of activities.
What do you want me to talk about?
Well, there are many things you could talk about. I will give you the opportunity to select.
I think there are one which we need to one of the things which keeps my interest for a long time is whether the transboundary water of the international rivers, where it will lead to what kind of, whether it's the war or the. You are not going to talk about that. That's good.
You're the person to talk about it.
So some things which I thought, we do see a lot of things in the media that there is going to be water war. And that's some things which has been going on since I started my postdoctoral research in 1991. And it's always this that the weather that, I mean, of course, then in the as you were mentioning, Geoff, that in the change of the time, we on the around 99 something was the water peace, those kind of things came up. And now and I always thought that there is not going to be water war. But then the question is there any war which takes place? For what reason? We don't know that. I mean, if I imagine why US is attacking Iran, can anybody give me one reason? And do you think that others would agree? You don't. I mean, any war you bring in, somebody asks you why this fight is going on, nobody will give that reason. But saying that, I think there has not been any war on the specific reason of disagreement over the war. I will tell you the one on the Nile in the Africa, which has been in the 90s, I think when even people like Human Dixon and others, they were projecting the Nile next to what, I mean, besides the Secretary General and others, there's a long list, but among the academics who were interested in that, the Nile will be the river where the war will take place. And the dam was being getting ready in the 2021. I was an in-house expert of Al Jazeera for 3 years. During the time when they tried to fill the dam, because during the July or August, around September, when the water, so the dam gets filled first time, then there will be war or something. So every evening I come to the Zoom that time, because that's COVID was going on, so all the time the Zoom studio, and then they will ask, when do you think there will be next war? When do you think Egypt will wage the war on? I said, no, that's just calm down. There is not going to be war. So every evening there is always this question: when do you think Egypt will attack Ethiopia over the Nile River? No, it's not, and it hasn't done yet. I mean, the dam reservoir is filled, so I don't think there is going to be attack. There are various reasons. I can go on why, at least 3 main reasons why the war is not going to take place over the water, particularly over the dams. The similar thing happened on India-Pakistan, the Indus River, which usually you will hear this is given as an example of the World Bank successful river negotiations. I don't want to, some of my friends work in the World Bank, I don't want to really criticize them heavily, but I always think that, just don't overhype. I never think that as a water agreement, it's a partition agreement between India and Pakistan. It's just 3 rivers giving to India, 3 rivers giving to Pakistan. But then last year, for the first time, Indian leaders wanted to withdraw from the agreement, which is the World Bank negotiated agreement. Then I remember that when there was almost war-like situation, the Times London called me saying that I was in hospital going for a regular checkup, and I was waiting for the doctor so I could take the phone. For 1 hour, I need to convince him that there is no war going to take place. They're not going to attack each other's dams. And I thought I did my job despite being in the hospital. Next day, the Times London Sunday, the headline was the next war, the war is going to take place over water in the India-Pakistan. How do you explain these people that there are other issues which are really more challenging, but the media discourse will be very different than what exactly the situation is? And I think it is very important for us as a researcher to understand the significance of the environmental diplomacy or water diplomacy. It might not able to bring peace, but it has the number of ingredients to keep the war restrained. Take, for example, when this, in the second day of the Iran war, there was an attack on the Iranian desalination plant in the island, which affected 30 villages not getting water. Iranians targeted another one in the, I think it's in the west, there is another desalination plant. And but after that, it got stopped. And recently, when the last week or this week, in the beginning of this week, your president told that they were going to attack on the energy infrastructure in Iran, Iranians responded, we are going to attack the energy infrastructure as well as the water desalination plant, water infrastructure. Nobody told that, but that's what Iranians specifically told, the water infrastructure will be targeted. And that brought down the temperature that they realized, you know why? A country like Qatar, country like Kuwait, country like Bahrain, 90% of water, fresh water, comes from the desalination plants. In Saudi Arabia, it's around 50%, but all the big cities, in UAE, around the same. All these big cities, whatever has been created, if you attack the desalination plant, you cannot really, those cities will be again the desert. And so the implications are extremely high for the people to go to these groups to engage in this kind of attack on the fresh water supply. So I think we need to see that there is a certain factors in the areas like water or any areas like critical minerals, the areas of which are critically important for the economy, for the survival. There will be waging war against them or waging war on specifically for that purpose will be not that easy. So that will be a restraining factor. And those are the whether with the help of that we'll be successful in conducting environmental diplomacy, that I have doubt for. We might sign agreements on those resources, and those are the specific resources agreement can be signed. But what the diffusion we are talking about for the last 20 years, that these kind of agreements, whether it will lead to the peacemaking in other areas, that's the questions, or that's something which we are yet to find very successfully. If the regions or the countries do have other very serious issues. Like take, for example, I'll give you quickly, when India, Bangladesh signed the Ganges agreement in the 30 years back, it's just coming back, it will be another serious matter. It's a 30 years agreement. Suddenly, several issues which they had problems with, they had certain kind of diffusion effect after that. They sorted out border issues, they sorted out political issues. Of course, the political leadership helped, which the political leadership was in Bangladesh. The India, Pakistan have signed this Indus agreement since 1960. While the agreement was signed, they fought 3 wars in between. They kill each other all the time. But then that doesn't really lead to other issues. So I think we need to have, it has a possibility, it will help us in certain ways to restrain the conflict, sometimes to address other areas, but I think we need to be very careful to generalize this issue in the longer, larger, and for each and everyone. There is, as I keep on saying, the golden rule is there is no golden rule.
He's hard to follow. I sat here because I thought then I'd get to talk before him. I'm also going to talk about water, and I'm going to start with 3 facts. One hopeful, one surprising, and one absolutely maddening. The state of California uses less water today than it did 50 years ago. Not less water per capita, not less water per dollar of economic output, although those are absolutely true. Less water in the absolute, fewer gallons or acre feet or cubic kilometers, which is how you measure really big amounts of water. Our inefficiencies are our opportunities. And that's a really clear example. So that's the first fact. Second fact, the number of people on the planet who don't have an adequate modern sanitation system is numbered in the billions. We argue about the data, but it's clearly numbered in the billions. 2,000 years ago, Claudius, the emperor of the Roman Empire at that time, introduced the first modern urban sanitation system to the city of Rome. The number of people who do not have a sanitation system available to them today, and it would be a waterborne sanitation system, and water is the key to why they don't have a sanitation system, who don't have that system that was introduced in Rome 2,000 years ago, numbers in the billions. That's a shocking statistic, and it tells me sometimes we're just not serious. The third fact, there's a toilet in my house. It's full of water. I don't drink from it, but if it were clean, I could, because it's world-class drinking quality water. We clean water using an enormous amount of energy and therefore contributing to climate change to a world-class standard. We then use a lot more energy to pump it to my house, which is a good thing. I am blessed to be on a water grid for both clean water coming in and sanitation going out, and it makes my life immeasurably better. We put 6 gallons of that world-class drinking water and that deeply energy-intensive drinking water into my toilet. And then I put a few ounces of urine in the toilet and I flush it, and I notice you have the nice new, low water flow toilet, so maybe it's only 3 gallons flushed away when you flush your few ounces of urine. Where does that water with a little bit of urine in it now go? It goes to a sanitation plant for cleaning, not to a drinking water standard, but to a world-class standard. And then it gets discharged into the river. You could not design a more inefficient system for the use of water for that sort of purpose, and yet that's what we do. So I ask the question, what will we be doing with water 50 years from now? How will we manage water? There's no question, to put a little optimism into this room where it really needs it, there's no question that many, many, many places in the world, I would say a majority of places, despite the violence around water, despite the deprivation, despite the rights violations, despite the land grabs, despite all of that, which we should never forget and never set aside, most places in the world are managing water more effectively today than they did 50 years ago. What will we be doing 50 years from now? We'll be storing more water. California is the breadbasket of the United States and one of the breadbaskets of the world because it is blessed to be able to have 2 growing seasons, not just one. And the reason it has 2 growing seasons is all the rainfall occurs in the first 5 months of the year, the calendar. And then just when the dry season comes, nature gives the farmers of California an enormous gift from the snow melt from the Sierra Nevada mountains. And you have a whole second growing season based on runoff and irrigated agriculture. Well, climate change is making that snow melt arrive lesser and maybe in March instead of in August, right? And the whole sort of socio-ecological dynamic around farming in the Central Valley in California is faced with a really difficult challenge of how to adapt to that. So we will store more water to smooth out those kinds of uneven distributions of water. We will recycle more water to get rid of the absurdity that I described around the toilet in my home. We will price water more appropriately and not pretend that it's a freely abundant resource. Treat it like the scarce resource that it is. And we will have to design our landscapes, our human settlements, our urban spaces to be more resilient in the face of flooding and in the face of droughts. I raised my children for 14 years in a small mill town in central Maryland, suffering economic decline, much like we're seeing here in Eastern Ohio, trying to reinvent itself around tourism, historic preservation, and boutique shops and restaurants and so on, and trying to do that. 2 fatal flash floods in my town, each runoff from an overpaved watershed. And the middle of town is down by the river for a very good reason, right? Because the water power drove the Industrial Revolution in this country. 2 fatal flash floods where literally cars driving up the hill, we have cameras that show this footage, cars driving up the hill, 6 minutes later washing back down the hill because the flood is just dragging everything down toward the river. Dumpsters, cars, people died in this flood. Twice, each based on an allegedly 1 in 1,000 year rainfall event within the space of 22 months. After the first flood, the town launched, I thought, a very appropriate, very progressive, smart attempt to say, how are we going to live in this space of flood risk? How are we going to protect this town? What needs to change? How are we going to adapt to this? How can we be sort of like a model resilient watershed? 4 square mile watershed, small town. After the second flood, the wheels came off and it became a bitterly politically conflicted issue. And so when I think about water 50 years from now, I am very confident we will store more water, we will recycle more water, we will price water more appropriately, and we will live in more sensibly designed landscapes, given the water challenges we face. You can't get flood insurance in the state of Louisiana. That's driving change. The question that I focus a lot of my attention on is, how will we do that? We know that storing more water is essential, and places that cannot store water, including many countries in the world, are at the mercy of the rainfall. But we also know that storing water in large quantities can be an ecological and human rights nightmare for the people that live in that space. People get displaced, they get pushed aside, it destroys freshwater ecosystems, it has downriver effects for 100 kilometers or more, et cetera. So how are we going to store it? Recycling water is great, but I can tell you there are people that live downstream for whom that water you just recycled is their livelihood resource. I've done a lot of work in Palestine over the years, and I have spoken to and engaged with Palestinian farmers. And they grow figs and they grow olives, dates in particular. And if you saw the water that they were using to grow those crops, you'd never eat another date. But for them, it's a key livelihood resource. And if something is happening upstream to recycle the water, we would say hooray for that system, because it's foolish to not reuse the water, but you're also redistributing that water and you're creating very serious challenges for the other people who relied on it. So it has to be part of a conflict resolution process. It has to be part of a dialogue process. Pricing water. Of course, we have to price it appropriately, but what does that do to the many, many, many people who can't afford it already, right? And redesigning the landscapes. Who's got to move? Whose community gets obliterated to make room for the river? So my big concern is not that we will move in those directions. It is inevitable. It is coming. You can see the seeds of that already. And a lot of it is exciting. When you work at watershed scale, you see people innovating and making changes and doing better all the time. But the question is how? How do we do it in a way that's conflict sensitive? How do we do it in a way that is rights sensitive? How do we do that in a way that's equitable? And how do we do it in a way that's based on deliberative dialogue? How do we avoid the trap my little town fell into of thinking that we could master plan the watershed in some sort of technical marvel, and realizing that what was really at stake was the different visions that people had for how we wanted to live in that watershed. And as we had to start making real sacrifices, are we going to tear down these historic buildings that have been here for 300 years, longer than the United States was a country, because they're in the floodplain? Who's going to have to move? Are we going to ban housing in a county where teachers and firefighters and police officers can't afford to live anymore because it's gotten too expensive and there's no housing? How do we deal with these sorts of issues? So for me, I am very long-term optimistic about engaging those problems. But I think we have to keep our eyes on how we do it and what is the path forward, and how do we do that in a way that is respectful of traditions and rights and peace. And that's where I put a lot of my energy these days.
Well, thank you for a lot of fodder from both of those questions. I definitely have more myself, but I'm inclined to open it up for conversation and then interject if the opportunity arises. So because we are webcasting this, I think we'll kind have you state the question. I will try to restate it, right? And then hand it over. The speaker can restate the question so those folks online can hear it. If you could just let us know who you are, and then we'll have some of these questions. We might even gather a few up and then can divide and conquer among the panel. So who would like to kick us off with some questions? Yes, please, in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Duschinski. I'm from Ethiopia, and I'm currently a graduate student, political fine artist. I'm writing on the neighborhood politics in Ethiopian cultural institutions, and I'm glad you visit, the neighborhood. And I found that it's okay. So I'm really interested. So my question is, the idea of this global governance framework, and how do you think this idea of global governance framework would be? And is it really a solution, or is it really a problem for the neighborhood conflict in the region?
Okay, terrific. So a question on Ethiopia, on the Nile, in terms of the interface between the basin-wide agreements and the global environmental governance, and kind of problem or solution or a little of both. That's a fantastic question. Thank you. Why don't we get a couple more? Yes, please, sir.
Okay. Thank you for the question. My name is Stevie JC, and my final year in the African Peace Program. And also my project is on environmental justice like that. Yeah. And I'm basically looking at the soil and water quality. And my main goal is looking at how indigenous knowledge or ecological system can be integrated into environmental governance. So throughout your presentation, I was hoping to hear maybe how the indigenous, because you are looking at the international sphere, how have you been engaged with the indigenous, and how are their knowledge assisting in fighting these ecological issues? Because most often, I think when we assume one solution will work in every place, we tend to fail. So, yeah.
No, fantastic question. We heard a lot about the role of states and national level leadership, and less about some of the voices that, like indigenous voices and local voices, that sometimes are and sometimes are not included in this discourse. And so how is that, or could those voices make a difference in such, and bringing these issues and concerns and solution sets into them? Excellent question. Felipe, one more, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond.
I want to know what's the perspective of the militarization of conservation, of the militarization of natural resources. For example, I come from Ecuador, and now the political system is that, for example, the indigenous territories that are part of the national parks now are militarized for the destruction of essential resources. And this is part of like the long-term plan that the government has, like for example with critical with strange minerals, I think it's called. So by militarizing those territories, they access, they go even against the constitution of countries. And this is something that it's now happening in Chile and happening in probably, I guess, Peru or maybe Bolivia. So what do you think about this concept of militarizing natural resources?
Terrific. So a question in the case of Ecuador and some of the Andean countries about the role of militarization, even in spite of protections, constitutional and otherwise, for protected areas, on the basis of the importance of mined minerals and metals and critical. And so the kind of contestation and this trend towards militarization to provide access, overriding even constitutional protections for the environment. So Ken, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, great questions. Tempted to answer all three of them. I'll start with the point about indigenous knowledge. I'm glad you raised that question. So we have a relationship with, my university has a relationship with the University in Costa Rica, and we do a lot of work in a particular river basin in Costa Rica that is under great stress and duress. And climate is changing, and there's this area that's called the Central American Dry Corridor, And basically what it's doing is it's working its way down into Costa Rica. And so there's a little portion of Costa Rica that's very dry and drought prone and so on. And most of Costa Rica is quite lush and tropical and one of the wettest countries in the world. But everybody knows that the dry corridor is descending its way down in that sort of stress. They mostly grow pineapples in this river basin. Del Monte Pineapple Company is a big landowner and they produce a lot of pineapple that is sold in North America there. And I'll just make two observations about indigenous knowledge in the context of that particular case. It's a very conflicted basin because half of the people want Del Monte out and the other half work for Del Monte and their livelihood is tied to Del Monte. And they understandably, they might want changes, right? Del Monte uses a lot of pesticides and so on. The water's not, there's problems there. And Del Monte, I'll just say, I think is a big part of the problem there. But that doesn't mean that people whose livelihood comes from working for that company, their goal is not to drive the company. So there's a lot of tension and social conflict in space. I was there recently and we were talking with some farmers. We had a chance to talk to some indigenous farmers. And I was, like you, very interested in this question. They have usable knowledge, they have ties to the land, they have cultural traditions that shape how they grow, et cetera. This has to be of some value. And I realized that part of what I was doing was I was romanticizing indigenous knowledge because the farmer says, we have this incredible storehouse of knowledge, but it doesn't work here anymore because the climate has changed. And so we're struggling along with everyone else. I thought, that's discouraging. Right? At the same time, one of the most interesting conversations that's bubbling up in this basin is, what did we do before pineapple? Well, we had cattle and coffee. Yeah, but that was imperialistic too, and that was, Western investors and so on. What did we do before cattle and coffee? What did we used to grow? How did we used to grow it? And that's where I think some of the traditions that have been kept alive by indigenous people, because they're growing side by side with people who don't have an indigenous heritage. They have a broadly similar life. They're poor, they've got a little bit of land, or they sell their labor, or what have you, and so on. And so on one level, I think it is important to kind of situate indigenous people not at some sort of romantic, primordial, before the world got modern and cruddy sort of thing. They're living in the modern world, same as us. But there is nonetheless that sort of storehouse. So one of the things that my university tries to do, you'll notice I always bring it back to peace and conflict resolution. One of the things that we have tried to do is be a sort of a neutral third party so that indigenous communities in that basin and non-indigenous communities facing similar challenges in that basin can come together and dialogue about what the basin needs. Because they have been pitted against each other in a sort of a victim-on-victim conflict as things have gotten more challenging in that basin. So they do not have the ability to dialogue and talk with each other because of there was an indigenous activist that was murdered while I was there once. And so trying to be that space where they can kind of come together and bring out that sort of dialogue. So I think it's really important, but I don't think we should assume that it is magical, and I don't think that we should assume that those kinds of dialogues are going to be easy. A lot of thoughts on the Nile, but I'm going to pass it on. The one thing I will say about that, we can talk afterwards because I do. Two things to note about the Nile, right? The Arab League brought the whole question into the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council refused to deal with it. They spent a day on it, but they refused to deal with it. And they kicked it back to the parties. They said, you have an obligation to resolve this peacefully, but we're not imposing a solution. You have to sort of work it out. And the reason the Security Council did that is because there are more than 300 international rivers in the world that either form borders or cross borders, both. And many of them put countries in challenging upstream, downstream relationships that Ashok was talking about. I share his view that the whole water wars dialogue is overblown, it's simplistic, it doesn't really understand where conflict really comes from and so on. But the Security Council didn't want to touch that case because they would do nothing but mediate international river disputes if they went into that space. So I think to me, the message of that was, this is a regional question. It's not a global question. If you could bring energy into the conversation and you could talk regionally about water plus energy needs in the basin, the number of cooperative opportunities would amplify greatly. And, upstream, you need to build a minimum level of trust, and you need to make it be not simply about water, but about water, energy, climate adaptation, and regional economic integration. And then I think that you have a chance. The other thing I'll say about the Nile before I pass it on is Egypt and Sudan, the downstream countries, the countries that are clinging to treaties that were signed in the colonial era and claiming that they have a legal right to all the water because Britain signed a treaty with them and ignored all the upstream non-countries or countries of the time, 100 years ago or more. Egypt and Sudan import more water in the food that they import, embedded in the food that they import every year, the water it takes to grow that food. Because neither Egypt nor Sudan is a country that has the capacity to completely feed itself today. They import more water through that food growing exercise than flows down the Nile in a typical year. And so the challenges around water, energy, climate adaptation, regional integration, et cetera, we have to think about them more holistically than simply a question of who is allocated how many cubic liters of water at any point in time. Cubic meters, sorry.
Thank you. Now it's my difficulty to answer you.
Right back at you.
Okay, let me start with the Nile, and I will focus on the Nile and get into those two other questions. The Nile issue is, I agree the Security Council didn't do much cannot do much because the presence of China in the Security Council. If you go back to the UN non-conventional use of international watercourse convention, the three countries those who went against voted no: China, Turkey, Burundi. Nobody knows what Burundi, why it voted for. Neither Burundi knew. It's only
it's upstream on the Nile.
Yeah, but I mean there are other upstreams. They also didn't. Yeah. So China is the only country China controls large volume of water which supports most of the Southeast Asia, South Asia as well as Afghanistan. So I think they have a huge interest of keeping the upstream. So so they will veto anything if any goes. It's not only on the Nile. They will any water issue they will veto it if that goes against the upstream rights. So that they are understand. Coming back to I think what has happened in '99. Though I'm going to the regional issue, how that even regionally felt the Nile issue. '99, World Bank got into this Nile Basin Initiative. Many of my friends, those who are part of this, they don't like me when I say that this is again going to fail. I remember 2001 in the Brussels, I was asked to organize a meeting of the donors where the World Bank people would come and have meet all the European countries, donors, all their, it was so. It was the meeting. I think I remember it's 2001 sometime in summer. I organized that meeting, but it's a long time. I mean, I'm old, so so that's and then the question was how the other European countries would put the money into this. There is my main concern was the Blue Nile and the White Nile. There are two different Nile rivers. What happened, the international community, rather than solving the issue at the Blue Nile level, they combined those two and make it much more complicated to address the Blue Nile issue. Because you cannot, it's too many cooks, right? Too many, not cooks, too many cooks. Yeah, they both said now. Crooks, yeah. So, but too little broth in that. So you don't bring in 10 countries to get this main problem which is happening in the Blue Nile, where 87% of water Ethiopia supplies and only 4% uses. That's not going to work. So you need to find a way out how to really manage it, where there is no significant harm is being caused to the downstream countries, which is Article 7 of the UN Convention, and Article 5, which is the equitable use, which will be Ethiopia using. And there, I think the World Bank tried to put this and did. The one thing which come into the indigenous knowledge, because there was this question was when there was somebody asked to this World Bank people, I'm not naming them, they were there. So have you asked people, how many people you have, because you made this agreement or at least this among the countries, did you speak to the people? Those were the stakeholders. They didn't talk to the indigenous or the stakeholders. No, we didn't, because that will complicate the process. And that's not long, that's not 1960s or 70s. That's 2001, for 99 or 2001. This was knowledge to everybody that you do that, that's the thing. So coming back, what can we do? I think what Ken was suggesting at this time, that's the only way out, that how to connect, because Egypt is very much interested on how to get this energy. Ethiopia is interested in energy, because the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is not a water diversion dam. It's not a multi-purpose dam. It's a hydropower dam. That's energy is needed. If anyone has gone to Ethiopia, Ethiopia needs energy. Ethiopia needs also fresh water. Nobody can doubt that. So Egypt, of course, Ethiopia, because the upper riparian, and there is just other countries like Sudan and Egypt are downstream and extremely dependent on the. Of course, there is more than 50% wheat. Egypt has to eat wheat. I remember 90s when I used to come to teach at the American University. I was even offered to buy a land in the western part of the desert, because the new areas Egypt was creating for the agricultural land. I didn't have money to buy it, either I wanted. So what I think they can do, that if Egypt can give energy guarantee to Ethiopia, because the problem has been that it's a climate change, actually one of the main issues, because there is water. Water is not going. There is a little bit of evaporation will take place, not much, because the evaporation will be more in the Aswan Dam rather than in the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So the water is not going where from the system. The system is who controls the water. Here, Ethiopia controls the water. Egypt will be at the mercy when it needs the water that Ethiopia will supply. But Ethiopia doesn't need water to keep it, because Ethiopia needs energy. So if Egypt can guarantee the energy supply to Egypt, I'm not getting into it, but there are ways you can do it. It's actually a political will is needed. But we also need to realize in Ethiopia or Ethiopian leadership, there is not on many issues Ethiopians agree, except the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is a major factor for Abiy to unite the country. But it is also at the same time, keeping the issue boiling with Egypt also makes the problem. So I think it's a politically problematic, it's a political will needed. The water is not going anywhere. You just need to make political accommodation to address this. You want to say something?
I just wanted to add, well, one of the people who was unable to be with us here today, Erica Weinfeld, the professor who's doing the NATO briefing, I'd encourage people to look at her work in Central Asia around this same question, because the situation at the end of the Cold War, all of the Soviet republics, former Soviet republics of Central Asia, were in a very similar difficult challenge. Water that had been managed centrally from Moscow was suddenly flowing over the borders of 4 or 5 newly founded countries. And they did not have a tradition of cooperation. They had challenging upstream dynamics, downstream dynamics, etc. And Erica did a lot of really good field work in that space at that time and wrote a book that you'll find or email us or something about how it became possible to start to seed international cooperation among these countries, including how the countries used the creation of cooperative structures and treaty signing to leverage international assistance and so on and so forth. And so a moderately hopeful story that came out of that space at that time. And it's a shame that she's not here today, although we all agree she should be, I guess, where she is. But just wanted to shout that out since she was originally supposed to be part of this panel.
Thank you. Just very quickly about I will give you in a minute. We're talking about the militarization of protected areas, isn't it? That's the. I had actually a project long time on how the protected areas piece, and as you know, there are different types of protected areas. We do have our own way of protected areas. I mean, now I'm talking about an European or the US, Canada, they do have them, and we have imposed different protected areas on the global south. And I think the management is very different. The issue is that the way I'm just going only one aspect of it. The way the governments are pressurized by the West or the Japan to create or to manage this protected area is a major problem. I had two major fights with the Japanese cooperation agencies because they thought that I am actually going against their principle of that people will not be taking part in this management of protected areas. It's actually a very it has its own regional dynamics, it has its own national dynamics, it has now the new issue of the dynamics of the critical minerals or different minerals issues or the terror activities or going on in different places. But I think it's also a major issue as to how global North has been putting that kind of imposing its own way of how to manage resources on the global South. And that has been not taking interest or not taking the local challenges into account, but we have our own donors and donor mindset into mind.
Yeah, thanks. I'll start with the militarization.
If you start after Ken and me, of course you will have less time. So.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. But so many opportunities to get you back. I'll start with the militarization because I think it's really clear and prominent that conservation has been and continues to be highly militarized. But I think we can't miss that it's part of a very large pattern. Dam construction sites are highly militarized when they're building them. Mining, all mines are highly militarized. The ones in the north are pretty militarized as well. They're not as violent every day, but they're pretty rough. And so what you see here, right, is that you have the persistent pattern of people next to these very valuable assets being excluded from benefits and participation in the valuable. So you have to militarize long distance power lines in many parts of Africa. You have to militarize oil and gas pipelines in many parts of the developing world because people know that there's high value tourists seeing high value apes and monkeys in the conservation site, or their high value resources are flowing, and they are being systematically excluded from participation, right? And so I think that what we have to, this is why our colleagues who do things like political ecology and some of the sort of critical approaches to understanding extracted systems that often or consistently include oppression of some people and the extraction of high value resources for other people, they're right in some of these, in some of the ways they deploy these concepts, that this is systematically structural, you're systematically adding more structural violence in a lot of these areas. And so while I'm 100% on board with critiquing the securitization of wildlife conservation, which by the way is also absolutely terrible on gender and other kinds of human rights fronts for people in local areas, highly militarized, hiring private contractors, local private contractors to do highly militarized stuff has community violence all over it. And anybody who works in these areas will tell you this. But we have to also see the pattern, right? We have to see that it's not just securitization or militarization of environmental conservation, in particular high value parks. It's quite consistent and it's happening across several continents. And it's true of mining, extraction, and it's true of some infrastructural development, and it's true of major pieces of valuable infrastructure. It's true in ports, because there's so much valuable stuff going in and out, then you get highly militarized, localized violence. So I think that our critical colleagues and our the research approaches who are serious about structural and endemic violence against people who are poorer and more marginalized around these centers of wealth creation and extraction, they're right that these things are systemic. And it's a very easy out to say that it's a very easy out to blame only local officials or kind of international conservationist rules, although I agree with Ashok that these models have been universalized and imposed. We have to see that they're systematically similar and that they're happening across lots of contexts. So it's not just a particular cultural value, or you hear sometimes practitioners sometimes get a little frustrated because they think that, the violence is going along some ethnic difference in one particular place. Like, well, it may manifest itself in that way in one particular place, but this is built into the systems that we are continuing to expand for the extraction of very valuable resources, for the protection of things that yield high value reputation or other kinds of economic values. And if we build in ever more militarization of things, we get ever more violence on the borders of that, and you get ever more violence of the people who are being handed the guns. And I'll end by saying that, we don't have to talk only about the global south for that country, right? We've spent the last 15 months in this country highly militarizing, allegedly, we know it's highly militarized, and it's allegedly about immigration enforcement. But we also know that is rapidly built a violent, systematic, a bunch of systematic oppression and violence all over the country. And that is because that's the choice that was made. The choice that was made was to deploy more violence at local levels all over the place. It's no longer enough to have violence at the border itself. We have to make sure that we have violence in all of our borders, all over the society. It's a systematic, it's a choice about systems. And so we got to get at constantly be critical of the pattern, of the extraction, of the quick turn to the use of violence by people with power against people with less power, because that's the direction that the violence is being pointed.
So I'll say my third question that I opted not to ask, in part because you'd addressed it, but you have even further here in terms of this role of the environment, peace, and conflict, and the use of violence. And in this conference that we just came from, one of the kind of looking forward 50 years in terms of global environmental politics, it was Ken who said, I hope we will continue to remember that these questions of conflict and violence go hand in hand with structures of international treaties and such, and that these are not separate conversations for different journals, different conversations. And so you all three have made it clear that some of these topics that we're grappling with very much do that. So we hit the appointed hour of 5 o'clock, and so we will break formally. But I know all three of our panelists would welcome you all coming up and continuing the conversation with them here, and get in touch with me, and I'll connect you with them and online and follow-ups, because as you can have heard, they've thought long and hard about many dimensions of these questions, and many more that we haven't been able to talk about. And all of you, I know, are really digging into these topics as well. So connecting you will be very productive going forward. Want to again thank our colleagues at CIS and the School of International Studies and Languages for this forum. Thank all of you for attending, those of you online for tuning in. I think our hope is that the video from today will be something that's available so that you can share it with others who weren't able to be here live. So please join me in thanking our panel for today's discussion. Do we have the cards that we can do some selection?